He conquered the world before turning 26. The greatest conqueror in history, Alexander the Great.
This map tracks one of the most rapid and violent territorial expansions in human history. By 323 BC, Alexander the Great had marched his army out of Macedonia and conquered his way to the borders of India. His tactical brilliance on the battlefield shattered the Persian Empire. At high-stakes clashes like the Battle of Gaugamela, he led the charge himself, risking his own life to break enemy lines. But at age 32, resting in the palace of Nebuchadnezzar in Babylon, his body failed him. After days of heavy drinking, severe abdominal pain, and a raging fever, with modern historians pointing to everything from acute pancreatitis to malaria, Alexander lay dying. When his generals gathered around his bed and asked who should inherit this massive empire, he offered a cryptic reply: to the strongest. Almost instantly, the men who had conquered the world together turned their spears on each other. Those 3 words triggered 50 years of relentless, brutal civil warfare, known as the Wars of the Diadochi. Millions of people died in the fallout. For all his military genius, Alexander was a catastrophic failure as a state builder. The collapse of his empire was a mathematical certainty, engineered entirely by his own hand. The first fatal flaw was built into the core of his military structure. Alexander relied on an elite group of officers known as the Companion Cavalry, or Heteroi. This organizational chart shows how he managed them. He deliberately avoided giving these generals fixed ranks. Instead, he assigned them temporary commands based entirely on his daily whim. In combat, this fluidity worked perfectly. The army could rapidly adapt to changing terrain or enemy tactics because every order flowed down from a single, unquestioned supreme commander. But with Alexander dead, the system imploded. These highly ambitious generals expected power, yet they had no defined hierarchy and no permanent authority over one another. Without a chain of command, there was no legal mechanism to resolve a dispute. Violence was the only tool left to establish a new hierarchy. Alexander compounded this instability by eradicating any political institutions that could have survived him. There was no Senate, no independent bureaucracy, and no governing body. He centralized absolute power into his own physical person. To solidify this singular authority, he adopted Persian customs and demanded his subjects and generals perform obeisance, treating him as a living god. We can see this physical self-deification on silver coins minted after his death, which feature him wearing the ram horns of Zeus Ammon. He showed lethal intolerance for anyone who questioned this absolute rule. When highly capable, loyal veterans like Parmenio or his close friend Clitus pushed back against his demands, Alexander had them executed. This created a toxic psychological environment among his surviving staff. His generals learned a very clear lesson. Survival required eliminating threats preemptively and hoarding as much personal military power as possible. By making himself the entire institution of government, Alexander guaranteed that his physical death would be the immediate death of the state. Despite exposing himself to constant danger on the front lines, Alexander recklessly refused to provide an adult successor. On his deathbed, the only options left for the throne were his mentally disabled half-brother Aridaeus and an unborn child carried by his wife Roxana. This map illustrates the general's fragile initial attempts to compromise. At the partition of Babylon, they carved the empire into regional satrapies for themselves to govern, while waiting for the heirs to come of age. Ptolemy took Egypt, while Seleucus claimed Babylon. The compromise lasted only until paranoia took over. Recognizing that a weak heir offered no protection, the generals systematically murdered the regents, Alexander's mother Olympias, his wife, and eventually his young son. By failing to secure a legitimate successor, Alexander created a lethal vacuum. To claim the throne, his generals had to annihilate everyone else connected to his bloodline. This 50-year collapse climaxed in kingdom-defining clashes like the Battle of Ipsus in 301 BC, where hundreds of thousands of Macedonians fought to the death. Looking at this final map of the region, we see the permanent aftermath. The unified empire fractured forever into distinct, warring Hellenistic states, dominated by Ptolemaic Egypt, the Seleucid Empire, and Antigonid Macedon. Alexander knew how to conquer a map, but he lacked the foresight to design a system that could outlast him. He left behind no institutions, no clear hierarchy, and no heir. His generals didn't tear the empire apart simply out of personal greed. Alexander's flawed blueprint dropped them into a world where conquering their former friends was the only way to survive.